I am M27. Growing up, it was always just me and my mom. My dad walked out when I was 4, and after that, it was the two of us against the world. At least, that's what she always said. She'd tell me I was her miracle, her greatest blessing, the best thing that ever happened to her. She worked hard, long hours, 2 jobs sometimes, but she made sure I had everything I needed. But even with all that, things were never easy between us. She had high expectations, and nothing I did ever seemed good enough. If I got a 90 on a test, she'd ask why it wasn't 100. If I got a promotion, she'd wonder why it wasn't a better job. Every compliment had a hidden criticism buried underneath. It felt like I was constantly chasing approval that never really came. A few months ago, I lost my job. It wasn't my fault. The company downsized and a bunch of us got let go, but it didn't matter. Rent was too expensive, and after burning through my savings, I had no choice but to move back home. I told myself it would be temporary, just until I got back on my feet. The second I stepped through the door with my bags, things felt off. It wasn't anything obvious, just a shift in the air. My mom didn't say much, just nodded and went back to watching TV. I paid rent, helped with groceries, covered some bills, but it still felt like I was imposing. The little arguments started fast. Dishes in the sink, laundry left in the washer too long, me sleeping in too late even though I was up all night applying for jobs. It was like we were strangers living under the same roof but forced to interact. Then came the dinner. My aunt, my mom's younger sister, was coming over. My mom was unusually stressed, making sure everything was perfect. She made a big meal, set the table with the good plates, even lit candles. It was weird. She never did things like this. She was always the type to say, "We're family, just eat." But tonight she was acting like this was some kind of formal event. I helped set the table, did what I was told, and then went upstairs to change before dinner. That's when it happened. Her bedroom door was slightly open. I was about to walk past when I heard her voice. I don't know why I stopped. Maybe it was the tone, tired, frustrated. Maybe it was just instinct. But I stood there, just for a second, and then I heard it. I never wanted to be a mother. I stopped breathing. If I could do it over, I wouldn't have had him. My stomach dropped. She kept talking. I love him, but I never felt that motherly connection. I did my best, but I was never meant to be a mom. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. I gripped the wall to steady myself. My aunt sounded shocked, telling her to stop, but my mom just kept going. She said she envied my aunt's freedom, and that she wished she had made different choices, that she only stayed because she had no other option. Not because she wanted to, not because she loved me, because she had no other option. I stood there, frozen, listening to my mother, this woman who always told me I was her biggest blessing, admit that I was actually her biggest mistake. Then, my aunt's tone changed. She must have seen the door was slightly open, because she suddenly steered the conversation away, talking about something random. I didn't wait to hear more. I rushed back to my room, shut the door, and sat on the edge of my bed, staring at nothing. I couldn't process it. The words kept repeating in my head, over and over. I never wanted to be a mother. If I could do it over, I wouldn't have had him. I don't even know how long I sat there before I realized I was shaking. I'd spent my entire life believing that, no matter how hard things got, at least my mom loved me. At least I had that. But now, I didn't even have that anymore. Every memory, every I love you, every hug, it all felt fake. Manufactured. A lie she told herself so she could get through the years. Someone knocked on my door. My mom's voice, light, casual, told me dinner was ready, like nothing had happened. I didn't answer right away. I could hear my aunt talking downstairs, the clinking of plates, the scrape of chairs. I could pretend I didn't hear anything, or pretend things were normal. Or I could walk downstairs and sit across from the woman who had just admitted she wished I was never born. Either way, I had to decide fast. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic mashed potatoes filled the air as I walked downstairs. Everything looked normal, plates set, candles flickering, my aunt already seated, but it felt wrong. My mom stood by the stove, smiling like this was just another family dinner. Like she hadn't just admitted she never wanted me. She turned, cheerful, asked me to grab the salad from the fridge. My aunt looked at me, quick and cautious, her eyes darting away just as fast. I sat down. My mom passed me a plate, asked how the job hunt was going. I mumbled a short response. She nodded enthusiastically, like she actually cared, before launching into a story about work. I barely heard it. Her voice blurred in my ears, drowned out by her words from earlier. I never wanted to be a mother. If I could do it over, I wouldn't have had him. I picked up my fork. The food looked good. It should have tasted good. It didn't. My aunt kept sneaking glances at me, her expression tight, like she was waiting for me to say something, or explode. I chewed slowly, forcing myself to swallow, while my mom carried on, her mood brighter than usual. She laughed too hard at small jokes, asked too many questions, praised me for things she normally brushed off. At first, I thought it was guilt. Maybe she knew I overheard. Maybe this was her trying to make up for it. But the more she spoke, the more I realized she wasn't acting guilty. She was acting like nothing had happened. My responses got shorter, one-word answers, nods, shrugs. She noticed. She tilted her head, her smile faltering just a little, asked if something was wrong. I told her I was just tired. She didn't drop it. She never did. She asked if something had happened today. Was work stressing me out? Did I hear back from any interviews? My aunt jumped in, changing the subject, talking about some new cafe she wanted to try. My mom let it go for a moment, but a few bites later she circled back. She pressed again, insisted I was acting strange. I set my fork down, looked straight at her, and I asked, "Do you ever regret having me?" The room went dead silent. Her smile froze on her face like she didn't understand the question, or didn't want to. Then, too quickly, she laughed. said something about how that was a silly thing to ask, but there was a pause. It wasn't long, maybe a second, maybe less, but it was there. My aunt stiffened, picked up her glass, took a sip of water like she wanted to disappear. My mom kept talking, brushing it off, saying she'd always loved me, that I was the best thing that ever happened to her. But I saw it, the flicker of hesitation before she answered. The way her smile felt forced now, too wide, like a mask she had to hold in place. I didn't say anything else, just nodded, picked up my fork, and kept eating like nothing had happened. But I knew. She hadn't expected me to ask, hadn't planned for it. And for that one split second, before she caught herself, before she gave the right answer, I saw the truth. I finished my plate without tasting a single bite. After dinner, I stood up, thanked my aunt for coming, and walked upstairs before my mom could say anything else. She called after me, her voice light, asking if I wanted to watch a movie. I ignored her. I shut my door, locked it, sat on my bed, staring at the wall. I needed to leave. Not in a month. Not in a year. Not when things got better, because they wouldn't. I grabbed my laptop, started looking at apartments. Studio, one-bedroom, basement rentals, anything cheap, anything far enough that I wouldn't have to see her every day. Because after tonight, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't stay here anymore. The next morning, the house was quiet. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, stretching across my ceiling. I stared at it for a while, waiting, listening. Footsteps in the hallway, the clatter of a pan in the kitchen, my mom humming, like nothing had happened. I got up, got dressed, and walked into the kitchen. She stood by the stove, flipping pancakes like we were in some kind of family sitcom. She turned, smiled, told me to sit. I sat. She poured coffee into my mug, asked if I had anything planned for the day. I didn't answer, just stared at the steam rising from the cup. My phone buzzed. A text from my aunt, "Are you okay? We should talk." I ignored it. My mom sat across from me, cutting into her pancake, completely unfazed, acting normal, like she hadn't shattered everything the night before. I picked up my phone again, opened a job site, and started applying to anything I could find. Warehouse work, retail, receptionist gigs. It didn't matter. I just needed enough to get out. She noticed. She asked what I was doing. I told her I was job hunting. She nodded, said that was a good idea, then started talking about some drama at work. A coworker had been late 3 days in a row. Someone else was stealing office supplies. I let her talk. More applications. More resumes sent out. More searches. She finally stopped, set down her fork, and looked at me for real this time. Something was wrong. She could feel it now. She asked if I was okay. I kept scrolling. She asked again. I put my phone down, looked her in the eye, and said, "Why do you care? You never wanted me anyway." The color drained from her face. For the first time, she was speechless. I didn't let her recover. I told her I heard everything. The night before. The conversation with my aunt. Every single word. She stammered, said I misunderstood, that she didn't mean it like that. I repeated her own words back to her. I never wanted to be a mother. If I could do it over, I wouldn't have had him. She panicked. Started backpedaling. Said she was venting. That she was just tired. That she didn't mean any of it. I laughed. She kept going. Said I was twisting her words. That I was taking things out of context. That of course she loved me. I asked her how long she'd been lying to me. If it was my whole life. She got defensive. Said she gave me everything. Put a roof over my head. Paid for school. Worked double shifts so I could have a good life. I nodded. Took a sip of coffee. Then I told her, that wasn't love. That was obligation. Her jaw clenched. Her eyes flashed. She said I was being ungrateful. That I was throwing everything she did back in her face. That she sacrificed so much for me. I told her she didn't have to. She could have walked away. But she stayed, and instead of loving me, she resented me. Her hands curled into fists on the table. She opened her mouth, then closed it. My phone buzzed again. My aunt. I ignored it. The room was so quiet I could hear the ticking of the clock on the wall. Then my mom's face crumpled. Tears welled in her eyes. Her lips trembled. She whispered, "You're all I have." I pushed my chair back, stood up, and grabbed my keys. She called my name. I didn't turn around. I walked to my car, opened the door, sat inside, and just sat there, staring at my hands on the steering wheel, wondering if my mother ever actually loved me at all. I found a place faster than I expected. It wasn't much. A small one-bedroom rental on the edge of town, but it was mine. No shared walls. No one knocking on my door, asking where I was going, what I was doing. Within 2 weeks, I signed the lease. I didn't tell my mom right away. I packed up slowly, filling boxes at night, making trips to my car when she was at work. My aunt showed up the day of the move. She didn't say much at first, just grabbed a box and carried it to my trunk. Halfway through, she sighed, said she understood why I was leaving, but that family was complicated, that maybe, with time, things would get better. I didn't answer. We loaded the last box. I looked at the house one final time, standing in the driveway. The curtains in the living room shifted, someone watching. My mom. She didn't come outside, didn't say a word. I got in my car. My aunt gave me a quick hug, told me to call her if I needed anything. Then I left. The first night in my new place, I sat on the floor, surrounded by boxes, eating takeout straight from the container. No yelling, no footsteps in the hall, no forced conversations, just silence. For the first time in years, I felt like I could actually breathe. A week later, I got a job offer. Nothing glamorous, customer service at a small company, but it paid the bills. I took it without hesitation. I didn't tell my mom. A month passed. Then, a text. "Hey, how are you?" That was it. No apology. No mention of the last conversation we had. Just a casual message, like nothing had happened. I stared at it for a while, then locked my phone and went back to my day. She sent another the next morning. "I miss you." I didn't answer, A few days later, my aunt called. I let it go to voicemail. I know you're upset, but she's still your mom. You should talk to her. I didn't call back. Therapy wasn't something I ever thought I'd do, but after everything, I needed to talk to someone who wasn't family, someone who wouldn't try to justify her words or tell me to forgive and forget. The first few sessions were hard, unpacking a lifetime of feeling like I had to prove my worth, realizing that no matter how much I tried, my mom was never going to be the person I wanted her to be. Accepting that was the hardest part. Another message from my mom. This time, longer. I don't know why you're ignoring me. I love you. I always have. Can we talk? I didn't respond. Then, a call. I let it go to voicemail. Her voice was shaking. She was crying. Said she was sorry. Said she missed me. Said she didn't know what she'd do if I was really gone from her life. I listened to the whole thing, then deleted it. I'm not angry anymore. Not really. I just know now. She's never going to change. She wants things to go back to the way they were, where she says the right words and I pretend they mean something. But I'm done pretending. I'm not chasing after someone who never truly wanted me. And for the first time in my life, I don't feel like I have to. A month had passed. No calls, no texts, no sudden guilt-tripping messages. It was quiet. Peaceful. Then, the knock came. At first, it was light. A few quick taps. Then, louder. More urgent. I stood in the middle of my living room, phone in hand, staring at the door. Another knock. Then my name. I walked over slowly, careful not to make any noise. Checked the peephole. It was her. Her hair was a mess. Dark circles under her eyes, like she hadn't slept. She shifted on her feet, arms wrapped around herself, glancing down the hallway like she expected someone else to show up. I stayed frozen. Another knock. Harder this time? She called my name again, louder. My neighbor's door opened slightly across the hall. Someone peeked out before quickly shutting it. She wasn't leaving. I exhaled, unlocked the door, and pulled it open just enough to stand in the frame. She looked up, startled, eyes already glassy. Then she started crying. She stepped forward, reaching out, but I didn't move. Arms crossed, I leaned against the doorframe, blocking her way in. She wiped at her face, took a shaky breath, and started talking. She missed me. She was miserable without me. She didn't mean to hurt me. She never wanted things to turn out this way. The words were fast, frantic, like she had practiced them before showing up. I didn't say anything, just watched her. She kept going, said she had been under a lot of stress, that things came out wrong, that I misunderstood. Something in my chest burned. I stayed quiet. She hesitated, searching my face, then tried again. Said I was taking everything the wrong way, that I didn't hear the whole conversation, that she didn't mean it like that. I finally spoke. Told her I didn't misunderstand anything. She tensed, eyes darting to the floor. Then, like she couldn't hold it in anymore, she blurted it out. You took what I said out of context. Of course I love you. But raising you alone was hard. Silence. The words just sat there. I stared at her. Then I asked, so because it was hard, that means I wasn't worth it. Her face twisted, like she wanted to argue, like she wanted to take it back. But there was nothing to take back. She had said exactly what she meant. She opened her mouth, closed it. I straightened, dropping my arms to my sides. Told her I deserved a mom who actually wanted me. Told her I didn't think she'd ever understand that. Then I shut the door. Her voice broke mid-sentence, cut off by the latch clicking into place. I stood there, hands still on the doorknob, listening. Silence. Then, a sniffle. Then footsteps retreating down the hall. A door shut somewhere in the distance. I turned, leaned back against the door, and exhaled. My phone buzzed. A text from my aunt. What happened? She's saying you're being cruel. I locked my phone. Didn't respond. Then I walked into my bedroom, shut off the light, and let the silence the night after shutting the door in my mom's face. I lay awake for hours. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard her voice, saw her standing there, crying, begging me to listen. Morning came, but the weight in my chest didn't lift. At my next therapy session, I told my therapist everything. The visit, the confrontation, the way I felt guilty even though I knew I shouldn't. They listened, nodded, then said something that stuck with me. Guilt doesn't mean you did the wrong thing. It just means you care. That was the problem. No matter how much I tried to shut it off, part of me still cared. But caring wasn't the same as going back. Over the next week, I found myself thinking about the past more than I wanted to. All the moments that should have told me something wasn't right. Elementary school, when I got first place in a writing contest, but she barely looked at the certificate before telling me to set the table. Middle school, when I broke my arm and sat in pain for an hour because she was too busy on the phone to notice. High school, when I got into my dream college, but she only cared about how much financial aid I was getting. Every "I love you" always felt rehearsed, like she was saying it because she knew she should, not because she felt it. I had spent my whole life trying to be enough for someone who never really wanted me in the first place, and I hadn't even realized it. A week later, an envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. My name written neatly on the front. I knew before I even picked it up. I stood there on the front steps, turning it over in my hands, debating. For a second, I thought about throwing it away unopened, but my fingers slipped under the flap anyway. Inside was a letter, written in blue ink. The first few lines were an apology, the kind that sounded real on the surface, but underneath, something was off. Then the truth spilled out. She never felt maternal, never had that natural connection. She thought if she kept saying I was her greatest blessing, if she repeated it enough times, she would start to believe it. But she never did. She admitted she resented how hard raising me alone had been, that she looked at other women, women without kids, and envied their freedom. She wrote, I don't blame you for leaving. I just hope one day you'll forgive me. That was it. No request to talk. No mention of making things right, just an admission of what I had already known. She never wanted me. I read the letter twice. Once to take it in, the second time to make sure I hadn't misread anything. Then I folded it back up, walked to the sink, and struck a match. The paper curled, dark edges eating into the words. Ash drifted down into the sink as the flames consumed the last piece of hope I didn't even realize I had still been holding on to. I washed the ashes down the drain. Then I pulled out my phone and sent one final text. I forgive you, but I can't have you in my life. Before she could reply, I blocked her number. That night, for the first time in my life, I felt free. Free from waiting for love that was never there. Free from hoping she would wake up one day and see me as something other than a burden. I wasn't her obligation anymore, and she wasn't mine. I don't know what comes next, but I do know one thing. I'm done looking back. I'm a 29-year-old guy, and after years of hard work and saving, I finally managed to buy my own place, a 3-bedroom house with a decent-sized backyard in a nice, quiet suburban neighborhood. This was huge for me. I had spent years budgeting and doing everything I could to save up for it. I was just ready to enjoy a space that was truly mine. The place wasn't massive, but it was exactly what I needed. It felt like the perfect mix of comfort and coziness, with just enough room to make it feel like a real home. The yard was a bonus. I could already picture hosting a few friends over, maybe even getting a dog eventually. I was beyond excited to start making the space my own. When I closed on the house, my friends and family were thrilled for me. It felt like a huge milestone, not just because I had a house, but because I had done it on my own. My parents in particular were really proud. They even threw me a housewarming party to celebrate, inviting some extended family and close family friends. It was a great night, honestly. There was a lot of laughter, good food, and even some old embarrassing stories from my childhood. It felt like everything was finally falling into place. During the party, my parents briefly mentioned they were having some financial troubles. They didn't go into details, and I honestly didn't think much of it. I assumed it was temporary, or that maybe they were just struggling with some minor expenses. My parents had always been pretty self-sufficient, so I figured they'd be fine. After the party, I started planning some improvements. I had ideas for how I wanted the place to look, repainting the living room, setting up a home office, and just adding my own touch to every corner. I was excited to settle in and finally enjoy my own space. I felt like I had really earned it, and now it was time to make it feel like home. But then, just a week later, I came home from work one day and found my parents standing on my front porch, bags in hand. They told me they were in a tough spot financially and needed a place to stay for a bit, just until they got back on their feet. I was completely taken aback. I didn't know what to say at first. I mean, this was my dream home, my sanctuary, and I'd only just moved in. But seeing them there, looking a little worn out, I felt like I couldn't just say no. I agreed, though I told them it would just be for a week or two, thinking that surely they'd sort things out soon. They seemed grateful, and I figured it would be fine for a short time. We talked a bit about living arrangements, and I set some basic ground rules. I made it clear that this was a temporary setup, and that I still valued my personal space and independence. They nodded along, agreeing to everything. The first few days were manageable. I felt like I was on edge though, constantly aware that I had other people in my home, but I kept telling myself it was temporary. Things started to get a bit weird though. My parents didn't exactly stick to the temporary vibe. They started rearranging furniture, moving things around in the kitchen, and even bringing in a few items from their own house, which they claimed would make the place feel more homey. One evening, I came home to find that they had fully stocked the kitchen cabinets with food they liked, almost as if they were settling in for the long haul. I tried to brush it off at first, thinking maybe they were just trying to make themselves comfortable. But after a few days of this, I realized they weren't really acting like guests. They were treating my place more like their own. After seeing how things were going, I decided to have a talk with them. I kept it calm and tried to be as respectful as I could. I reminded them that this was just a short-term arrangement and that I needed them to respect the space and keep things the way I had set them up. They listened but kind of brushed it off, saying they only wanted to help make the place feel nicer. It felt like they were just ignoring what I'd said. Pretty soon, they started inviting a few family friends over without even asking me. I'd come home to find people I hadn't expected sitting in my living room, chatting like it was their house. That was the tipping point for me. I mean, I wanted to be there for my parents, but it was starting to feel like I was just a guest in my own home. One night, I noticed them whispering to each other in the kitchen. It didn't seem like a casual conversation. They stopped when I walked in, which made me feel like something was up. They seemed like they had a plan I didn't know about, which made me even more uncomfortable. I decided to vent to a couple of close friends. I didn't know what to do, and I was starting to feel trapped in my own home. My friends told me I needed to set some boundaries, and that if I didn't, things could easily spiral. They warned me that once boundaries start to blur, it can be almost impossible to get things back to normal. That conversation was a wake-up call. I checked my finances just to be sure, and realized I couldn't afford to support 2 extra people for very long. The whole point of having this place was to have a space that was mine, where I could finally start my own life on my own terms. But now it felt like that dream was slipping out of reach. With that realization, I knew I had to have another talk with them. This time, it couldn't just be a gentle reminder. I had to make it clear that this was temporary and that things couldn't keep going the way they were. I wasn't sure how they'd react, but I knew it was time to confront them before things got even more complicated. Update 1. A couple of days after I'd brought up my concerns to my parents, I came home from work, ready to have the let's make this temporary talk again. I'd rehearsed what I'd say and figured this time I'd keep it short and straightforward. But as soon as I started talking, they jumped in, saying they needed just a few more weeks to sort things out. They didn't give me any details or timeline, just vague promises that things were getting worked out. Then they started bringing up things from my childhood, how they'd worked extra shifts, how they'd sacrificed for me, and how they only wanted to help me make this house feel like a real home. They spoke about all they'd done for me, and how just for a while longer, staying here wasn't a big deal. I felt like I was suddenly on trial for something I hadn't done. I didn't want to argue, so I just nodded, thinking I'd figure out another way to bring it up. That's when things started to get weird in the house. My parents began taking over spaces, moving furniture around without even a mention. I'd come home, and the guest room was no longer just the guest room. It looked like it was theirs. Personal items of theirs started to fill up the bathroom, and some of my stuff was moved to make space. My house was slowly turning into theirs, and there was this unspoken vibe that they were settling in. One night, I was doing some cleaning when I found a stack of papers in the living room, likely things they'd brought over. Out of curiosity, I glanced through, and there it was, a document showing serious debt. I didn't dig into all the details, but it was clear they were way deeper into financial trouble than they'd let on. They hadn't mentioned this level of debt, and now it made sense why they didn't have a place to go. It hit me that they hadn't just come to stay temporarily, they didn't seem to have a plan at all. The next day, I brought it up, hoping they'd be honest. Instead, they downplayed it, saying they'd figure it out. They brushed off my concern like it was nothing, assuring me they'd get back on their feet soon. But they didn't seem to have any real plan beyond just staying with me indefinitely. That's when I reached out to a couple of friends for advice. Everyone told me the same thing. I needed to set a move-out date, something firm, so this situation didn't drag on. A day or two later, I got home, and suddenly, my parents were sleeping in the living room. They said they needed the guest room for storage since they had things they didn't want to leave in the garage. It didn't make sense to me at all, but they didn't seem interested in explaining. I didn't push it that night, but it felt strange seeing them camped out in my living room, as if they were the ones who had just moved in, not me. To blow off some steam, I posted a vague message online about boundaries with family. People responded with a lot of advice, most of them saying I needed to stand up for myself. Some even shared similar stories, which made me realize I wasn't the only one dealing with this type of family issue. It helped a bit to hear others' perspectives, but I knew just posting online wasn't going to solve anything. Meanwhile, it seemed like every house rule I had was now just a suggestion to them. I'd ask them to clean up after themselves in the kitchen, but dishes would be left everywhere. They'd have friends over without even telling me, and I'd walk into my own house, seeing people I didn't even know sitting around, making themselves comfortable. Each day, it felt less and less like my own place. Finally, I decided I had to confront them again, and this time I was firm about sticking to ground rules. This time, things blew up. My parents accused me of being selfish and ungrateful after all they'd done for me. They threw every sacrifice they'd ever made for me in my face. We ended up yelling at each other until I finally just walked out. The atmosphere was tense, and when I got back later, I found them giving me the silent treatment. They'd stopped talking to me altogether, going about the house like I wasn't even there. It created this tense, uncomfortable energy that made me start dreading coming home. This continued for days. I couldn't relax or even enjoy the space I'd worked so hard for. Every time I walked in, I knew they'd either ignore me or treat me like a stranger in my own house. My frustration was building, and finally I decided it was time to put an end date on this. I pulled them aside and told them that they had 1 month to find a new place. I didn't want to keep dragging it out, and I made it clear that this was non-negotiable. They reacted with pure shock, and it was clear they hadn't expected me to be so firm. They looked at me like I'd just done the worst thing in the world, accusing me of throwing them out on the street without caring about what would happen to them. My dad even said he couldn't believe I'd do this to family. It was an ugly moment, one that left a bitter taste, but I knew it had to be done. Now, the clock was ticking. I had set a boundary, but I had no idea if they'd take it seriously or if they'd keep pushing, hoping I'd eventually give in. For now, all I could do was hope that this move-out date would finally push them to find a solution, even if it was tough to stand my ground. Update 2. After setting the 1-month deadline, I hoped my parents would start making some progress. Instead, they leaned into guilt-tripping me hard. They would constantly remind me of everything they'd done for me while I was growing up, how they'd worked themselves to the bone to give me the life I had now. It was like they'd flip a switch, going from cold silence to a barrage of past sacrifices, practically painting me as heartless for wanting my own space. When I'd press them on actually respecting the deadline, they'd promise they'd do better about keeping boundaries, but nothing really changed. In fact, things just got worse. Anytime I'd walk into the kitchen, it was like a whole new layout, with things shifted around to their preference. Every shared space felt like it had been taken over, with more and more of their belongings spilling into the living room and even the backyard. At this point, the place didn't even feel like my own anymore. Then came the financial strain. With my parents there, utility bills started creeping up. Groceries, too, they never pitched in for any of it. Every trip to the store had me buying double what I was used to. They seemed to ignore that I was footing the bill for everything, as if it were a given now that I'd cover these extra costs. It didn't take long before I started noticing the impact on my bank account, which just added to the frustration. On top of all that, they started fixing things around the house. One day, I noticed my dad was messing with the kitchen sink. Apparently, he thought the faucet was a little wobbly, even though I hadn't noticed any issues with it. Of course, it ended up leaking afterward, and I had to call a plumber to fix it properly. Another time, he decided the bathroom door needed adjusting and ended up making it so it wouldn't close all the way. They just kept doing things like this, each time saying they were only trying to help. At this point, I was venting to my friends almost daily. One of them even suggested I look into legal advice. They said that if things continued, I might need an official way to enforce the move-out date, which honestly hadn't even crossed my mind before. Another friend said it might help to talk about the situation online, so I posted about it again, just a short update about trying to set boundaries with family. The responses were overwhelming. A lot of people gave supportive advice, while some even shared similar experiences. It felt good to see I wasn't the only one dealing with something like this, even if it didn't fix the actual problem. One night, I came home to find extra shoes by the door. My parents had invited a couple of relatives to stay for a few days, and they didn't even give me a heads up. I walked in, and there they were, lounging in my living room like it was the most normal thing in the world. When I went to check my room, I saw some of my things had been moved to make space for their guests. That was my breaking point. I was done with the silent treatment and pretending like everything was fine. I told them this wasn't working, that I'd had enough. After that argument, I knew I needed a real sit-down talk with them about the financial situation, hoping to finally get a clear picture of what was going on. We sat down, and they told me about debts way worse than I'd imagined, credit card bills, medical bills, and loans they hadn't been able to keep up with. It was a mess, and they didn't have any plan for paying it off. I suggested they look into financial counseling, maybe even a debt relief program, but they dismissed the idea completely. They insisted they didn't need outside help and that they'd figure it out. But it was obvious they were in over their heads, and at this rate, they'd never get back on their feet if they didn't make serious changes. This time, I made it crystal clear that the move-out date wasn't going to change. I couldn't keep living like this, and they had to find somewhere else to go. They tried to talk me out of it, tried to push for more time, but I held firm. I didn't want to keep going in circles. But that didn't stop them from trying to make things difficult. They started doing little things to get under my skin, leaving messes, playing the TV loud at night, almost like they were hoping I'd snap and tell them they could stay longer just for the peace and quiet. One morning, I went out to the driveway and found my car gone. Turns out, they'd taken it to run errands without even asking. When I confronted them about it, they acted like it was no big deal, saying they thought I wouldn't mind. That was the last straw. I had to draw a line, so I took the keys back and told them not to use my car again. After all of this, I started doubting myself, wondering if I'd done the right thing by setting boundaries. It felt like I was at war in my own home, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was betraying them by pushing so hard for them to leave. Every day felt like walking on eggshells, and I'd find myself second-guessing everything I did or said around them. The move-out date was getting closer, but with the way they were acting, I had no idea if they were actually planning to leave. The tension in the house was so thick you could cut it with a knife, and I was counting down the days, just hoping they'd finally respect the deadline. Update 3. With the move-out date closing in, I decided it was time to look into formal options. A friend of mine suggested talking to a lawyer about what I could do if my parents refused to leave. The thought made me uncomfortable, but after everything that had happened, I knew I needed a plan. I scheduled a meeting with a lawyer to explore my options, even though it felt like a last resort. At the lawyer's office, we went over the details of the situation. They explained that if my parents didn't leave willingly, I might have to go through a formal eviction process. I never thought it would come to this, but I felt some relief knowing there was a path forward. However, the whole process left me feeling drained. It felt strange, like I was planning to throw my own parents out, even though they'd been ignoring every boundary I set. Not long after, my parents accidentally found out about the lawyer visit. I hadn't planned on telling them until I absolutely had to, but they stumbled on some paperwork I had left out. That sparked a massive argument. They were furious, throwing every guilt-inducing statement they could think of at me. They accused me of betraying them, abandoning family, and even suggested that I was heartless for going to such lengths. It was intense, and there was no way to talk them down. They made it clear they thought I was in the wrong for even considering legal action. Afterward, I vented to a couple of close friends. They reassured me, saying I wasn't wrong for wanting my space back, and that I had every right to enforce the deadline. One friend even offered a place for me to crash if things became unbearable. That support kept me going even as the situation at home continued to spiral out of control. In the days that followed, I noticed small charges on my credit card statement. It wasn't anything huge, but enough to make me suspicious. When I confronted my parents about it, they didn't deny it. They claimed it was just for essentials and that they assumed I wouldn't mind. At that point, I realized I had to take full control of my finances. I canceled the credit card they had access to and made it clear that they weren't to use my money for anything anymore. They weren't happy about it and responded by acting passive-aggressive, leaving even more messes around the house and being openly dismissive of any requests I made. The house had become a complete battleground. They weren't even trying to respect the rules anymore. Loud music, messes in the kitchen, random items moved around. They seemed intent on making my life difficult. It felt like they were trying to push me to the breaking point. They also ramped up the guilt trips, constantly reminding me that we were family and that family is supposed to stick together no matter what. They were trying every angle to convince me to let them stay longer, hoping I'd cave and forget about the deadline. During another consultation with the lawyer, they advised that if things got worse, I could file for a formal eviction. They explained it would be a lengthy process, but at least I'd have legal backing if my parents absolutely refused to leave. It felt like an extreme step, but I was keeping it in the back of my mind. With the deadline only a week away, the tension in the house was at an all-time high. I could barely bring myself to walk into my own living room without feeling the hostile energy hanging in the air. friends were checking in on me constantly, and one even suggested holding an intervention. They wanted to remind me that I had every right to enforce my boundaries and that I wasn't the villain for wanting my own space back. They were supportive, urging me to stay strong through the final days leading up to the deadline. But as the final week ticked down, my parents became more desperate. They would tearfully tell me they had nowhere else to go, that they couldn't believe their own son would throw them out. It was hard to hear, and they were clearly trying to pull on every emotional string. At times, they'd switch to anger, claiming I was being heartless and selfish. The back and forth was relentless, and every day was a new layer of tension. One evening, they brought up the lawyer again, suggesting that my actions were completely out of line and that no decent person would ever do that to their parents. It stung, but I knew that giving in would only prolong the chaos. My friend's support reminded me that I'd done everything possible to make this work, and that I was only asking for what was reasonable. Finally, I sat them down for one last conversation. I reiterated that the deadline was non-negotiable. I explained that I'd given them as much time as I could, but I needed my space back. They argued, begged, and pleaded, but I held firm. I made it clear that the date wasn't changing and that, come the day, they'd need to find somewhere else to go. In those final days, I kept counting down, trying to hold on to whatever patience I had left. The emotional roller coaster hadn't let up, but I was resolute. I knew this was the only way to move forward, even if it meant making some hard choices along the way. Update 4. As the final day approached, the tension in the house was at an all-time high. My parents still tried to negotiate a bit more time, hinting at just a few more days here and there, hoping I'd cave at the last minute. But I held firm. I reminded them that they'd had months to sort things out, and the deadline wasn't moving. Eventually, they stopped asking, but they started dragging their feet, moving at the slowest possible pace, as if hoping I'd change my mind. On the morning of the move, things were chaotic. Every item they packed seemed to spark a debate. They'd pick something up, argue over whether it was theirs or mine, and then eventually shove it in a box regardless. Items I hadn't seen in years suddenly became essential, and anything I didn't immediately claim was fair game. I tried to stay out of their way as much as possible, but that only worked for so long. Every room became a new argument, and tensions only grew as the hours ticked by. Thankfully, a couple of my friends showed up to support me. They were there as a buffer, keeping me focused whenever things started to escalate and reassuring me that I wasn't being unreasonable. They also helped handle a few of the more awkward exchanges, stepping in to keep things calm whenever arguments started to heat up over what belonged to who. As the afternoon wore on, my parents finally started to load up their car. There was a strange quiet to it, a kind of heaviness that hung over the whole process. Despite everything that had happened, the reality of them leaving was hitting hard. When the last box was packed, they stood at the doorway for a long moment, saying their goodbyes with a mix of bitterness and sadness. There were tears, promises that they'd be back to visit, and a lot of silent moments. I could tell they were upset, and while part of me felt a relief, another part struggled with the fact that it had come to this. As soon as their car pulled away, I closed the door and just stood in silence, letting the weight of everything sink in. It was over. For the first time in months, I was truly alone in my house. The quiet was overwhelming, a huge contrast to the constant tension and noise I'd been dealing with. I felt both a huge sigh of relief and an uncomfortable emptiness. It felt like the space around me was too big, almost unfamiliar. I knew it would take time to readjust. Over the next few days, I started reclaiming my space, moving my furniture back to where it belonged, clearing out the piles of random items and making the house mine again. I took down things they'd put up, threw out old food they'd left in the fridge, and went through each room as if wiping away the last traces of their stay. I did a deep clean, scrubbing every surface, and with every room I finished, it felt like I was lifting a little bit of that emotional residue from the past few months. Slowly, I began to notice the financial relief too. Without the extra expenses of groceries, utilities, and random fixes they'd tried to make, my budget started to balance out again. The stress of worrying about money faded, and I found myself finally able to start setting aside some savings, something I hadn't been able to do since they'd moved in. My friends kept checking in on me, making sure I was doing okay, and giving me space to process everything. They'd drop by, share some laughs, and help me feel normal in my own home again. Their support was a reminder that I wasn't alone, even if the situation with my parents had made me feel isolated for so long. As the days turned into weeks, I had time to reflect. I realized just how important setting boundaries was, not only for my own peace but for the health of my relationships. Letting my parents stay without limits had eroded both my independence and our trust, and I knew now that I couldn't sacrifice my well-being for anyone, no matter how close they were to me. Months later, I heard through some relatives that my parents were struggling a bit but were managing. They hadn't found a permanent place yet, but they were trying to get back on their feet. It was tough to hear, but I knew that they needed this time to figure things out independently, even if it was difficult for them. Eventually, I reached out to check on them, just to see how they were doing. I didn't want this experience to permanently damage our relationship, even if we still had a long way to go to rebuild trust. We had a short, polite conversation, and I offered to meet up sometime. I kept my boundaries firm, letting them know I was there for them, but that things had to be different now. They seemed to understand, and for the first time, I felt like there was hope for a healthier relationship down the line. Looking back, I felt stronger, more confident in my ability to protect my space while still caring about my family. It wasn't easy, and it took a lot of tough choices, but I'd found a way to move forward with respect for myself and my boundaries. The experience taught me that it's possible to love family from a distance, and that sometimes that distance is what allows everyone to grow. Update 5. A few months passed with no contact from my parents. The silence felt strange, almost like a missing puzzle piece I couldn't quite place, but I knew I wasn't ready to let things go entirely. After everything that had happened, I needed to know if they were doing okay and to see if there was a way to move forward without compromising my own peace. Finally, I picked up the phone, took a deep breath, and dialed. When my mom picked up, there was a short pause before she spoke, her tone polite but a little wary. We exchanged small talk, catching up briefly. The conversation was tense but civil, like two people trying to remember how to interact without stepping on landmines. Eventually, my mom mentioned that they were staying with some distant relatives while they figured things out. She admitted that things were still tight financially but that they were making it work, for now. During the call, I decided to be upfront about the boundaries I needed moving forward. I made it clear I was willing to offer emotional support, but that my independence was non-negotiable. I couldn't go through another round of blurred boundaries and broken trust. My mom listened, and while she sounded a little hurt, she agreed. She even admitted, though reluctantly, that they had crossed a line by staying as long as they did. Near the end of the conversation, my dad chimed in, clearing his throat awkwardly before asking if I might be able to help them out financially. He didn't go into details, but he asked if I could give them a small loan to help them get back on their feet. The request caught me off guard. I could tell he was uncomfortable even asking, but there was an unspoken desperation in his voice that I couldn't ignore. I told him I needed some time to think it over, and we ended the call. Afterward, I met up with some friends to talk it through. They reminded me of everything I'd been through and how hard it had been to reclaim my space. They encouraged me to set strict terms if I did decide to help, and to make sure it wouldn't open the door to more dependency. Their advice made sense, and after thinking it over, I decided I was open to a one-time loan, but only if it was structured with clear terms. I called my parents back the next day and explained my decision. I told them I was willing to help with a small, one-time loan under the condition that they would pay it back. I explained I'd be putting everything in writing so that we were all on the same page and to avoid any misunderstandings. They sounded both relieved and a bit humbled, agreeing to the terms without argument. For the first time, they seemed to understand that things were different now. I drew up a simple agreement outlining the loan amount, a basic repayment schedule, and what I expected from them moving forward: financial independence and respect for boundaries. My parents were cooperative and even thanked me for the help. They admitted they hadn't realized how much their stay had affected me and apologized for not respecting my space. Hearing them say that felt like a weight lifting, like they were finally seeing things from my perspective. With the loan in place, I could feel a shift in our relationship. It wasn't drastic, but there was a new sense of mutual respect that hadn't been there before. They would call occasionally, mostly just to check in, and I found myself doing the same. The conversations were brief and lighter than they'd been in years, with neither side leaning too heavily on the other. It was like we were finding a new rhythm, one that didn't rely on guilt or expectations. Over time, my parents started to stabilize. They managed to find a modest rental and were gradually working their way back to financial independence. They stuck to the repayment plan, small amounts at a time, and didn't ask for anything further. Watching them follow through on the agreement reassured me that this new arrangement was working and that the boundaries we'd set were holding strong. A few months later, I visited their new place. It was simple, but it was theirs. They seemed proud of what they'd managed to put together, and I could tell they were working hard to make it comfortable. We sat in their small living room, and for the first time in a long time, the atmosphere was relaxed. We didn't bring up the past or the tension that had hung over us before. Instead, we talked about everyday things like old memories and family updates. It felt like we were finally on equal footing. Looking back on everything that had happened, I could see how much I'd grown through the experience. I'd learned to stand up for myself, to protect my space, and to set boundaries even when it was difficult. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had led to a relationship with my parents that was healthier and more balanced. They now respected my independence, and I respected the effort they were putting into rebuilding their lives without relying on me. In the end, we'd found a way to rebuild our relationship on these new terms. I knew there would always be challenges, but for the first time, I felt like we were in a place where we could handle them without falling into old patterns. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was enough. Through this whole experience, I learned that supporting family doesn't have to mean sacrificing your own well-being. You can care for the people you love without losing yourself in the process, and sometimes, the strongest relationships are the ones that come with a little bit of distance.